Maybe we should start just doing something stupid and then you switch and now I'm starting. I don't know.
Yeah, I just started the recording as you said that, so now I don't have to worry about it anymore. Perfect. We have already our first blooper. Excellent. Welcome to the Third Age Babylon 5 podcast. We are Meike, Layla and Alexander, three Europeans who are honestly a bit too young to have seen the show when it first aired, but we are here now in the Third Age looking back at this entire science fiction adventure and, well, trying to put our own spin on the discussions on each and every single episode. Today we are going to look at Midnight of the Firing Line, arguably the first episode or the proper introduction depending on who you ask. As always, we are going to start with a small introduction round where each of us reveals a tiny bit of our background or where our opinions on the show are coming from, and today's going to be all about the kind of literature or media we enjoy outside of science fiction, like kind of what is leading us here. And for my part, that's mostly the sort of fantastical, weird fiction and also a lot of horror that comes from like early 20th century, something like Lovecraft and such. I really, really enjoy for the big themes that are in there. What about you, Layla?
My favorite kind of literature, besides science fiction, is mostly historical fiction. So really big novels that tell all life stories around historical events. That's really my kind of.
Yeah, my part is, I'm actually a bit confused by now, which is my favorite, because ever since I started studying literature, I got in contact with so many different kind of genres, literatures, authors, that were so amazing that I really don't know where to put my favorite stamp on. So I have to say I like everything as long as it's written in a good way.
Okay, so at least you're not saying the standard thing of saying, well, ever since I started studying literature, I've stopped reading altogether, which is, I guess you've taken the opposite approach of just taking everything in, which probably is quite helpful, probably helps convince you to watch something like the old 90s TV show that we're going to look at today.
The only problem is, you start studying literature or something similar, you can't stop. You can't watch something just for fun because you can't stop thinking. You analyze everything you can in every way. So, if there's anyone out there who thought, "Hey, that's a good idea," if you want to have fun reading or watching something, don't.
Okay, as always, our discussion today is going to be split roughly into three big parts, where at first we're going to give our first impressions on the episode after a short synopsis. Then we each are going to pick a handful of things that sort of sparked our interest, which might be anything from big character developments or the big plot of the show or some tiny detail that just stood out to us. And finally, we are going to go into the third part of the discussion, our big tapestry, where we try to connect all the different pieces from this episode to the rest. We're going to start with a small synopsis, and for Midnight on the Firing Line, that's actually a fairly straightforward story, I would say. We open up with a pretty dramatic space battle, which is beautifully rendered in this old 90s style of unknown ships at the time attacking the Centauri agrarian colony of Ragash 3. It doesn't stay a mystery very long of who is behind this, as very quickly Londo figures out that the attack was actually conducted by Jakar and the Narn government, who have been provoking the Centauri for a long time and claim to do so as a form of justice for the previous occupation of their homeworld. As these news spreads, Londo is obviously not very happy about this, goes so far as to even consider an assassination attempt, especially after his own government decides that they are not actually willing to do a whole lot about this. Similar things are going on Earth, where a big election is coming up, and similarly the senators back on Earth are not very interested in getting involved in this brewing conflict somewhere on the edge of the galaxy, so they also order our heroes to kind of abstain from any kind of intervention. This leaves our ambassadors and the commander of the station to sort of fend for themselves and try to find some way to deal with this diplomatic situation without going straight up against the governments, but also get something out of it that they want. On the B side of the plot, we have also mounting radar attacks, which seem to have been getting worse over time, attacking, raiding shipping lines and using bigger and bigger weaponry that they usually shouldn't have any access to. All of these things come to a head in a final confrontation, which eventually allows our hero Sinclair to uncover a little bit of a small secret plot that the Narn essentially used to provoke the entire situation. Okay, with this in mind and a few more details that we probably touch on, let's start into our first impressions. What did this episode feel like, especially in contrast directly to The Gathering, the pilot episode, which was obviously a year removed from everything here?
Yeah. Well, I think now compared to the first episode, this looked a lot more professional, I think. It had a better quality, like some of the costumes changed, some of the makeup of the alien species still changed, and the quality in general was better. So this I really considered something I would just see on TV. The other one before was a bit more a proof of concept, basically. When I think about the first time I've watched it, I also have to say that this is the episode I've watched probably the most often, because we started over a few times. And we also started a few rewatches that we didn't finish. So this is the one that I know by heart, I think. But the first time I've watched it, I was actually, I don't know, I was just thrown into this episode and I didn't really get the context at all. And I was skeptical for a very long time if the things that were started there, the discussions that were opened up there, were interesting at all. While when I watched it again after finishing the whole thing, I wanted to watch it over and over again and reanalyze every conversation I had throughout that episode.
Okay, so pretty strong feelings from the outset.
Yeah.
Okay. How about you, Meike?
Yeah, I totally agree on that. It's the first episode, I watched it the same way, first the episode, then the movie. Now a second time for preparation purpose, the episode. It's a lot that happens, but you don't have the one thing that so much, it takes so much room that you know that is where it's going. You have so many sidelines, so many strings of stories going on. That it's interesting to see, because it totally matches the idea of this station where so many people gather and live and interact, which also proves the point that there are a lot of problems that occur on the same time. But while watching this without the movie, it's a bit. Yeah, I'm not sure how to phrase it. It's a bit not that satisfying, because it feels like I missed something, like the basic lines of why is that here, and which you get in the movie. So I think it's a bit hard on that.
Yes, this why is it here? Why is it happening? Why am I shown this? That is what I always thought in the beginning as well.
But what I really liked in the movie way more, what is for me missing in the first episode, is how diversity is handled. I mean, diversity wasn't necessarily something on the level in the 90s like now, but you had in the movie, you had a black doctor, you had an Asian women in the military that played major roles, and now they are completely missing. You just have a white cast. You have, I think I saw a few a background people with dark colors, but yeah, that's it until now. In the first episode, there's quite a lot or less representation of different cultures.
Yeah,
As
and we have
it's said.
Ivanova without a Russian accent. That's also kind of missing. I would like her to have one actually, but that's another thing.
That's an interesting thing. There are some interviews on why she sort of retcons in her head why her character doesn't have one specifically, which turns that into a quite interesting detail. But definitely, I would agree that things have gotten a little bit streamlined. And I find it very interesting that by making the very controversial choice of starting with episode 1 and skipping the Gathering movie, there's like a lot of appreciation for this pilot film now, which I don't think is usually there in most conversations about Babylon 5. So I'm very happy to see that. And yeah, just to finish off our first impressions, I also probably have seen this episode the most out of all of them, definitely way more than The Gathering. And for me, it feels, even though there's less context for everything, it feels very representative of sort of the atmosphere and the kind of story that is going to be dominant throughout most of the first season. And this is also why usually I choose this one to start out with, because I feel like if you want to get the overall vibe of the show, this one is going to convey that quite well. But okay, let's, because we already had some good starting points here, let's just launch straight into the main discussion. And yeah, I mean, one of the things that we can definitely raise as a point here is some changes have been made. You already mentioned that some changes to the cast have also been made for obviously real life reasons, but also story reasons that we are going to see. So maybe let's start there. Is anything there that stood out to you, maybe about the new characters that we see, or how they are handled here?
What I was quite happy about that we got a lot more knowledge about telepaths, how they come to be in this position, and what are the consequences if they don't follow the law, which gave me quite a feeling, or reminded me with I'm horrible with dates, but when homosexuals were sterilized because of their homosexuality. This kind of came to my mind because it's you have this ability, and your choice is either you use it in a way we want it, or you have to suffer consequences that are, there's just negativity as you do what we want, or you are cut off everything.
Yes, and also we were just talking about diversity and how it was lacking at this point quite a bit. And here I find it interesting that we see that we have this problem with other kind of humans within the human population. For a world in which we also have to deal with a lot of different intelligent species. It's kind of interesting that humans have discovered these people that have a slightly different gene that gives them this ability that completely breaks all the rules of our society that we have developed. That is kind of interesting about the telepath at this point.
It absolutely is. And I mean, we get this new telepath character in Talia, who I would say she also has been kind of streamlined from being the redhead turned into the blonde. I mean, in the 90s, even that is something that definitely still happens. But I do think she does get a little bit more agency in this story, whereas in The Gathering, it was very much a thing of there is a negotiation, so you get hired to be part of that, or we want to scan the Warlons, so we are going to basically coerce you into doing that. And here she gets a little bit more of a pivotal role, where she on her own discovers that Londo is going to make an attempt on Jakar's life, and she on her own decides that she's going to get someone to help with that. It's still very much a role where she more or less just facilitates the plot, but she does get a little bit more of a part to play, and she also does get sort of this little side story of just trying to figure out why is this lieutenant commander not speaking to me, which is interesting that she does that very openly in a world where it seems like not uncommon for telepaths to be kind of treated as second-class citizens.
Yes, and I think we have already this this problem between those two that can be used in so many different contexts, because there's Ivanova, and this person that has to work with her, so she has to be professional, and this person personally has never done anything to her, but she's part of something that really that she has a really personal problem with. So it's like, I know that you're not a bad person and you haven't done anything wrong, but I can't like you, I can't interact with you because I would be unfair, and there's this barrier, which I think can be something we see a lot in cultural contexts or in many different situations. Yeah, and I find that very interesting. Just that this difference is so set between them that at this point an interaction or a fair interaction does just not seem possible, just for how they two were born, and they are aware of it, but we see no way to overcome it yet.
And I think this also immediately gives this conflict a little bit more context than we usually get, because it goes beyond this idea, oh, somebody is just genetically different from you, there is just a difference from birth, therefore there's going to be animosity or stereotypes attached to that. Here we all immediately get this idea, okay, there is a conflict between these two, but it's also because there's already institutions in society that have been set up, and it's more that these institutions have had an influence on Ivanova's life in a way that she can't deal with.
I mean, she says, it's not you. I think she says something like, it's not you, but it's what you stand for. Yeah. And I'm sorry, but I just can't. Yeah.
But I think especially this conversation, it shows so good how complex the characters are built. I mean, at the first interaction between the two, you think, oh, Ivanova, what kind of bitch is she? Well, the first moment I thought, what is your problem? You just could say, sorry, I don't have the time right now, come back later or something. But you, at the very first moment, you feel this aggression. And then you get an explanation. And it's this, especially at the time, it felt quite a lot of cases to me where it was that someone was bad, and you never got a reason why the person is bad, because the person is bad.
Yeah.
So, and now you have an explanation. Why is this person acting this way? What are their feelings? And I think that is a perfect example for a lot of other characters where you see it. If it's Londo, if even Jakar, even if he's consequently doing stuff which you categorize in the bad section, but you have the reasons, not everything, but you have enough glimpses of information where you say, okay, there seems to be a lot that happened in the past that makes this person acting this way. And that's something I was really happy to see, because it means there's a lot of thought gone into the development.
Especially if you get somebody like this introduced as like a recurring character. If we know there's going to be a telepath on the station, it's great to see that the conflict that there exists is not something that can be easily resolved. Like in a lot of, let's say, racism analogies, if somebody ostracizes someone because of their skin color, it's relatively easy as the audience to sit there and say, well, just not do that, and then the problem doesn't exist anymore. And if that were the situation, well, that's not going to be an interesting character conflict for an entire season or an entire show. But here you have this idea, okay, both of these people actually come together and have a conversation. They have this conflict. They both see also that this conflict is bad, but there's also not an immediate situation on resolving this, especially in the case of the telepath, where I think the show is actually walking a bit of a tightrope in saying these are people that are being treated as a minority and treated with all the sort of ways that minorities are treated in the real world. But there's also more of a legitimate difference between them and the rest of the world. Like, Ivanova can't easily say, well, I don't like what Psychor has done, so let's just not have Psychor anymore, because it's very easy to imagine, yeah, but you have to do something about telepaths being in society, even just for their own sake. Like, it's going to need a different kind of education, a different way of learning how to live if you hear everybody's thoughts all the time. And that's like not even considering what that does to any sort of ideas of privacy rights or such that the society might have. So it's this interesting point where you see the conflict that they have shouldn't be there, but I can't also very easily just proclaim, okay, this is how you solve it, and then we can move on.
Yes, maybe would someone like to add something to the telepath at this point? Because if not, I would like to take the point that we had here about character building and about being given reasons for action to the next level and get to the, I think, main plot of the episode.
Gladly.
Because the main plot basically is the attack of the outpost, of the Centauri outpost, and the reactions on the station, and we see the council in action, which is very interesting because I think that's one of the main functions the station was built for. And we are introduced to the Narn as villains, basically. I mean, they risk a war, they perform this attack, but then we get their backstory of they are not the colonizers, like they are not like this big empire that wants to get parts back. They actually were attacked, they were colonized, they have this bloody history, and they suffered a lot. So we really see Narn and how their culture and their nation has developed over a course of terror, basically. So it's really just like the colonized nation fighting back, not the colonizer wanting to get their empire back. And that's interesting because it really puts you in a difficult situation because, of course, you can never like accept an attack like that. But you also have sympathies for a nation that went through so much under the Centauri, I think. And the point that I want to make is that we had a long discussion each time we watched that episode, in different ways each time, to the argumentation that Dylan brings in front of the council, like just demanding to stop this cycle of violence and completely disregarding the claim the Narns are having, the claim of getting their land back, the claim of getting justice, revenge for what they suffered under the Centauri. And her argumentation that she completely disregards that for the higher goal of peace, and that is problematic on so many levels, I think.
It's an interesting point also that she's the one making this point, because even this early in the show we had two conversations in the Zen garden between Sinclair and an alien ambassador, and in both times there's a little bit of kinship between these aliens and humans. In the gathering, we have this conversation where Dylan says, oh, this Zen garden here represents a philosophy that we also have at home. And she's like, there's 1,000 books on my homeworld that are written about this same kind of philosophy, and this is the level that she connects on. And then in this episode, we have a conversation between Sinclair and Jakar, and he also looks at the Zen garden and relates to humanity through that. But he says, well, we also used to have green gardens and forests and such on our homeworld, but we have lost all of that. So in one case, we have an alien species that says, oh, we have this representation of culture and such that we find on all these different worlds. And for Jakar, the first thing that comes to his mind is, oh, we used to have this as well. We would like to relate to humanity on the same level, but we can't anymore because it was taken away from us, which like very quickly encapsulates this entire perspective that he's coming from. But also is notably something that Sinclair in this conversation, at least to some degree, rejects and says, well, that is true and that is completely right that you're angry about it, but it's also not a justification.
Yeah, and I mean, basically, I think we see there the Centauri Empire being haunted by their mistakes of the past, because the Narn, as we see them here, are a result of their attacks and of their reign of terror. So yeah, here we see the consequences of that, which I find interesting, because the Centauri here the empire already is on a like not successful.
I mean, we see it that it's essentially given up on this colony, right? Like it's held a claim to it, basically out of courtesy, but when that is challenged by the Narn, they are also very passive about it.
Yeah. It's not directly linked to what you're saying, but if you watch or take a closer look at the costumes, or how they are designed, I think it kind of matches a bit what you said about Delenn and Lando, because Delenn is the style of her clothing is like Asian robes, like something Chinese, Japanese. I'm not familiar enough to differentiate there anything, but it feels like it would fit. Would also gets in good resonance to the Zen garden and to the philosophy behind everything. And if you take a closer look what Lando is wearing, at least at this episode, I'm not sure what it was in the movie, but it gave me a bit the feeling of French uniforms.
Absolutely.
This broderie, the buttons, how they're organized, the medal he's wearing or ornament, whatever it is he's wearing on his chest, the coloring, and I think this with the colonization part and everything, this fits quite good together.
Yeah, totally. And that also totally fits because the last time I think when we watched the episode, we also made this comparison to French thing when we saw what Lando had in his quarters and everything and his clothes. And really also went through history a bit and thought about in which era of the dying empire the Centauri are at the moment. Because we have Lando, who was still raised with all of these old values, which you pointed out the last time. He obviously has a form of crisis and depression that he's spiraling into because all of his values that he lived for are not valid anymore. And also interesting is his dialect, because I always had a fascination for the dialect that he has, and now we meet him in this episode, right? We meet his episode. What is he called? Veer, who has no dialect at all. Which is also interesting that maybe the younger generation just doesn't have this dialect anymore that comes with this identity. And this all leads to my favorite quote from that episode is basically Lando saying, "I'm long past innocence and fast approaching apathy," which just sums him up so brilliantly somehow. So yeah, I think it's really just this depression of we're this empire and now we don't even decide to fight back when they attack our colony and kill our people.
I think this episode essentially confirms, which I think you, Meike, brought up in the last discussion already, that his crisis is very much a personal thing. It's not that he really represents the interests of this grand empire that tries to strike back. He represents even something further removed from reality, this idealized version that maybe a lot of people in this empire still dream of, but that isn't really supported by the current government even anymore.
Yeah, because it doesn't fit the world anymore, but it influenced a generation. So you have maybe a lot of different versions of this same depression or crisis, because you had these ideals that you worked up to, and now they have collapsed. Yeah.
I think you can also, I think the image you get from his quarters, in the back, everything is filled with bottles and glasses and everything, which just screams he's an alcoholic. He's drowning his problems, his sorrow, his depression in alcohol. It just fits together with everything. Because I just have, when I put this all together, with especially with the French uniform style, it kind of feels like a dying Versailles.
Yes, very much so. And I mean, the whole screams being a drunkard, especially when he starts throwing these bottles against the wall. Like he's not only drunk, he can even get a violent drunk if things are not going his way.
And what I see in him in this episode, and let's just stick with this episode, of course, is that at some point, if you take too many of the ideals that people have lived up for and have worked up for away from them, then they also lose this hold in reality to realistically think about consequences. So I think when he just clicks off and says, "I have to kill Jakar," you see that he really lost this hold in this world, kind of, and just runs after these ideals even in this extreme way. So I find that very interesting when you see a well-told story about someone who was very idealistic and then loses that, what that also does to the consideration of consequences of their own actions, which also leads up to my favorite moment of the whole episode, which also includes Londo, him and from this episode, right? My moment with Sinclair and him.
You will have to give me more than that.
Where he tries to convince Sinclair to help him and just puts on his most sweet voice ever and approaches Sinclair like, my dear old friend. And Sinclair looks at him like, oh, what the fuck do you want now?
I don't know if this specific one that you're thinking of is in this episode, but there is...
But you have something similar with Lando and Garibaldi at the beginning.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that was the moment when he called Mr. Garibaldi with his accent. I just loved it.
Yeah.
It is so...
I could replay this the whole time.
He is absolutely also playing on this idea of being the dear good friend to everyone and going with that. And I mean, his relationship with Garibaldi in this episode is also very relevant because when he does snap and make this decision to go after Jakar, despite all of his drunkardness and depression, it's very notable that he still gets talked down from this. That it's not a complete loss of control here, but that he can actually be brought back. And the way that it is done is by appealing to the importance of his role for his people. That's...
And also, and in spite the fact that his nephew, which is apparently someone who is dear to him, is in danger. Yeah. Because you get the point where he says, "Oh, he wanted to this," and I said, "No, that's you can do better." But it feels more like I don't want you to get hurt, so I get you in a safer place. Yes. And because I wanted to put you in a safe place, you're now in danger because of me. And with this kicks in together with his depression, I think, which just fuels his momentum a bit more to this action.
Yes, and now that you say that, I think it's also, the scene shows him as very lonely, because, I mean, he's alone on that station. He has one other Centauri that he can relate to, but he's away from this homeworld that doesn't seem like his homeworld anymore, that has changed so much. So as soon as there's like any other humanoid being that can relate to him, he can actually reach him, but it just doesn't happen that often anymore because he often can't relate to the others anymore, and they are far away in another version of world than he's used to. So I think it also pictures him as very lonely. Yeah, really agree.
Which, I mean, even on the diplomatic level, he is confronted with when he talks about, well, my own world is not going to act with this assault, but maybe if we can rally the rest of them, we can embarrass my own government in doing this. Like, even on this diplomatic level, he knows how to use his station and knows that if he can just get some popular support behind him, that's going to be his big chance, which, given the look of his uniform and given the history we learn about the Centauri, is probably also a very rare occurrence that he has a chance to rally all the other non-aligned worlds behind his cause. I'm gonna assume that the history that his people have with the Narn isn't an isolated incident and probably is reflected in a lot of the other smaller histories that we don't see as much of.
Yeah, I mean, we get information about how the first contact of humans and Centauri happened. I mean, the Centauri were the first alien contact of humans that they were aware of. And they tried to trick them with wrong information about their ancestry. So the Centauri probably haven't the best reputation in the galaxy. That's true.
Yeah. But I think it's kind of cute if when Lando tries to argue his way out of this. Yeah, we thought you were something 9, but yeah, you were 12. Sorry. That happened.
A bureaucratic mistake, because our empire is just so big, you see. Yeah, that's a very, very cute scene.
Yeah.
But do you want to add something on this?
Not to this, no.
Okay, because we've now talked a lot about Londo and also a little bit the reasons why Londo's government ultimately decides not to act with Ragesh 3. We can move on to the second point, which is probably very interesting in relation to that, the reasons that Earth is not going to do anything because of this. And with Earth, it's much less long-winded colonial history on the surface of it. It's more that there's an election coming up and people don't want to rock the boat when that is happening. And I think the senator says it, Earth Alliance just can't play the policeman of the galaxy, which, especially in the 90s, feels like an interesting quote to put in.
Yes, I think that the more formal reasons are the elections, but I think also a bit of honest reasons that even none of those calculations are the memories of the last war. So I think Earth doesn't want any confrontation because Earth is still traumatized by the Memory War.
I'm not quite sure. The one who wins the election is the one who got re-elected. So he's
Yes.
the one.
The incumbent wins the election on the basis of cutting the budget, focusing more on Earth and Mars, and promoting Earth culture in the face of so many non-Terran cultural influences.
Yeah, the point the point I want to make is there was said that they don't want to unravel another war. So this is, I think, one of the reasons which at that point stops. The senator is stopped to do anything else but stay neutral, because that is the direction they want to go within the election. So they can't handle it otherwise, because otherwise everyone would say, "Oh, look, he's a liar. We can't vote for him."
Yeah, and I have such a cringe moment every time I have that when I hear the goals of the one that was elected. Like more budget for Earth, non-Terran influencers. Oh God, that's every time.
I mean, it's not very often that we see a lot of the higher ups back on Earth, but there's one shot that we get in a news broadcast of the two potential candidates for the presidency, and Santiago, the incumbent, is like the most stereotypical picture of the older politician that you can possibly imagine. Besides being a woman, his challenger is also significantly younger. So he seems like very consciously depicted as like the equivalence of the status quo politician, somebody who doesn't want to engage in any radical turns, but sort of wants to keep things going as they are.
Yeah.
What I think that end.
Yeah. What I find interesting to add to the decisions all of the other governments make and the council makes in the end is that we don't have a concept of all of these other worlds sticking together, like idealistically or legally in such a case yet. So I think what we developed, if we draw a line maybe to our latest history after World War II, we had this developments of the United Nations. We legally agreed on basic human rights. We kind of have our own definitions of crimes against humanity, which is important in wars and conflicts all the time. And we have definitions of war crimes. And here we see a world where different nations, cultures, and also biological species have to work together, and we don't have a concept of that yet. So that is only slowly forming. But in such a case, basically we have an international community, and in such a case, in such an attack, it has no legally guarded ways to react yet. So every nation wants to stay neutral and doesn't want to start an own new war, because we don't have something like a United Nations that could act like not as one nation, but like another legal instance. So here we have a world where that has not been developed yet.
I think what you mentioned there also puts into focus what makes Babylon 5 from this very beginning very different from a lot of other science fiction as well, where usually the situation that this first episode opens with, of a fleet attacking a civilian colony and taking it over, that's usually the fail state that we see. Like if we have a show that focuses a lot on diplomacy, something like Star Trek, obviously, that's usually what we want to prevent for an entire episode. And it's always this idea that if this negotiation fails, then a war might break out, and then things are already so bad that we can't let it happen so far. Because there is this idea that this stronger community exists, and there are precedents set for how things are supposed to be handled. There is this idea of certain rules and laws that have to be followed. Whereas here we see the council first in action, and it's basically purely crisis management, right? Like something has gone wrong, and now the council jumps into action and tries to prevent things from getting even worse. But it seems to be very much about setting a precedent, which might also be part of the problem, because this council doesn't really have an avenue for the Narn to challenge this Centauri colony outside of taking military action. If there was something like the agreed upon rules of how you deal with former colonies that have been swapped back and forth, then that might have been something that would have been pursued, or maybe the Narn wouldn't have done that anyway. But we don't get to see that because it's very much, no, this is one of the first times that something like this happens, and so the way that it is dealt with now is going to set the precedent for the future. But we are still in this process of figuring that out.
Yes.
Hey, right now I wanted to say something, but it just
evaporated. Yeah, I mean, we are recording this at the height of summer in terrible heat, so any sort of points lost and general confusion can be attributed to that.
Yeah, so I think my takeaway is that it's interesting to see a world where this has not yet been developed, but to have a place like Babylon 5 in action that definitely shows that in this universe there's a need for these things, great need for these things, and we are at the point where these developments have to start and have to take place. We need these legal guidance, we need these institutions that are on a higher level than all of these separate nations. And we can also move on to another point that's interesting about the decision-making in the council is the decision that Earth wants to make and the decision that Sinclair actually sets in motion and how he manages that.
Yeah.
Because just this
before you continue with this, may I get in there? Because I just remembered what I wanted to say. The point was a crisis. So we have a crisis here demonstrated to us. But I think especially the talk between Ivanova and Garibaldi, I think it's the casino where he's eating, gives off the feeling it's just another Monday for them. Because he's eating and they occasionally exchange or have a briefing, you could say. And it feels so casual, the talks or the situation. So, yeah. Just another Monday for them.
I mean, for Garibaldi, this is a nice characterization because on the one hand he says, oh, well, there's a war breaking out, the whole universe is going to hell in a handbasket. But at the same time, his greatest concern for the entirety of the episode is finding somebody to have like a nice evening with and go to watch some movies. And it's just interesting. I mean, he is kind of the stand for the everyman of the station, so all of these big historical events are happening, but at the same time, he also has to get through the day on just his personal level and probably has like the best time of sleep because of it as well, because his stress levels seem fairly balanced in this episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's also the point. He has a balance because he chooses something like these tools to stress to level down the stress he is getting through his work, which since you don't see this with others for the moment, think they don't have something like that. So you can assume they are stressed. They are. I mean, especially the ending where Sinclair is, I've finished. I'm done. Leave me alone. Tries to go to bed, and then we have a problem. Where you just see this and you get tired just from hearing it.
Yeah.
So you have this stark contrast between these characters, but also see what is actually needed. A stress relief.
And I think it's also fitting. I mean, of course, Daffy Duck is the one cartoon that they have the rights to and they can put into this episode. But I think even from the little clip that we get, it's interesting that Garibaldi enjoys this cartoon that is primarily about things going wrong. Like, he puts the rocket in reverse. Like, it's essentially a reflection of how he views his own everyday, where just, if anything can go wrong, it probably will. And you just have to persist through that. And I think that he views this as this kind of catharsis is interesting. And I do wonder if he ever manages to explain to Dylan why that is something that is enjoyable and funny to him, or if this is just, unlike the Zen garden, something that she will have not enough context to relate to.
But also,
sorry.
No, I mean, maybe this is a little bit off topic, but I also find that this scene is very well written. Like, I think in that scene you can relate more to Dylan probably than to Garibaldi. As someone who isn't a big fan of these specific cartoons, you are more like, okay, let's see what he's doing to have fun. Because I know a similar scene from another science fiction can I say what it is? From Stargate, where also a character from Earth makes popcorn and shows to someone from another galaxy how he likes to watch football, I think. And it's also a human, because in there we have humans everywhere, but it's like a darker skin-colored human who sits in front of this popcorn in front of this football, and you just get such a cringe because it's in another galaxy, but it's still just such a racist image, basically. So I really find that this scene is so much better written. It has this like, okay, I'm showing you something that is everyday life for me, but it is very tastefully written and it's relatable and not insulting anyone or anything.
It's also like a big difference whether, or yeah, sure, go ahead.
I just wanted to say the lens seems to be interested in it. It's not like she is forced to sit there or has some obligation, but she's there because she's interested. She doesn't really understand, but she's there. There are moments where she's smiling. So maybe she thinks, oh, this is cute, or just thinks it's funny how Garibaldi is entranced with this. I mean, baby elephants think we are cute. We humans are cute, so why not that way?
Yeah.
I mean, if anything, it's like a fun little riddle to her. Like, how does this make sense in the context of this character? Like, this makes it's strange, but in an endearing way, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. That's there we have this cozy feeling from the movie again.
Yeah.
It's...
Yeah.
So I completely got you off track, Layla. Sorry.
Exactly. Now let's try to move to your point.
That was just the last part about these cancel decision is the actions that Sinclair is supposed to set in motion and actually sets in motion, which I think is very interesting here, is that he basically wants to only take legally appropriate action, but really just stretches the rules. And that's very interesting, that it also shows, even if you have like all of these working mechanisms, like you have diplomacy and you have like chains of commands from Earth and you have the council, it also shows that you still need individuals that have their own mind, their own morals, their own opinions, and that know how to play with the rules and how to bend it to do the right thing. Which also shows that we're always at risk of having someone in that position who does the wrong thing.
And it's interesting that he does get around this rule, sort of utilizing the fact that he is a commander that likes to jump into his Star Fury and go into the space battle on his own. Like in the Gathering, we also saw that he's the one that goes down there and starts engaging in a firefight, which arguably is a problem. Like, it's not something that you usually want the captain of a station of like 250,000 people to do, but at least he seems to be conscious enough of it that he's like, okay, in this situation, that's actually going to be very useful. And then you can argue, well, how much is he doing this because he really just enjoys the firefight, but also is how much is there a bit of a calculus behind it of saying, well, if I'm conveniently not here, then this is going to work out a little bit more in a way that we want. The last person in the council discussion that we maybe ought to talk about, he just has a very small scene, is Kosh, because he's, I think, the third party who says, well, this conflict is brewing, we are not going to do anything about it. He says essentially to the effect, well, both the Centauri and the Narn are dying people, let's just not interfere with them at all.
That's what he says.
Exactly, which
doesn't make sense at the moment.
It doesn't make sense. It also makes no sense to Sinclair, because the entire Gathering movie was about trying to get this Warlon on the station and not having him killed, because the Warlons are apparently very interested in having a presence here. And then the first crisis comes along and they decide, yeah, that's not important to us. We are not going to be part of this. Which in the beginning we talked a bit about the kind of fiction we enjoy as a fan of anything that goes with cosmic horror and entities that are unknowable. It feels like he's trying to channel this sort of Cthulhuian energy of being like, no, I'm so wise and old, I'm above all these petty interests. But, if he's already gotten up and gotten to the station, you can rightfully ask, why then? Is it just entertaining to watch that, or what's really your point here? And
maybe he's just a person, the embodiment of internet troll.
Maybe he is.
Because when Sinclair asks him, what was it? I think the last question, who the Narn or the Centauri, moment of pause, and then yes.
Yeah, he answers in logical operators instead of human language. Yeah.
I mean, you say internet troll. What is the one thing that we know about the Warlords since the Gathering? No human ever gets to see them. If you see them, the myth says you are going to turn to stone. And then Sinclair gets led into Kosh's little quarter, and he sees the encounter suit empty. And Kosh is presumably naked somewhere behind the divider as this like floating light. Sinclair turns around once, and it does swoop, and he's back into his encounter suit, which is an entirely unnecessary thing to do unless you just kind of want to tease the commander with, I'm just here. You could get a glimpse of me, but you don't. Like, if you view it from this perspective of, he's trolling a little bit, he does have a little bit of attitude in that, of being like purposefully sort of playing around with the mystery that has been built around the Warlords already.
Yes, and he also shows Sinclair that he's studying Earth, right? There are images from my world.
That's later. That's later, but no, trust me, I just watched it.
Yeah, I would have one last point that could be big or small, I don't know.
Sure.
Because I wrote down that there's no common source of life in this galaxy, which I found interesting because in this show they talk about races. Constantly they call each other different races, which is a word that I in general have a problem with, so you will only hear me say species. But I find it interesting that, for example, in Star Trek we get an explanation that for all humanoid life there is a common life source, like what they just share the kind of molecules and then life had to evolve over a billion of years, but we are still kind of related. I mean, in this case, we would also be related if you think in molecules because we're in a real galaxy, but there is no common source of life. It's really just it all developed completely on its own. So here they probably chose the word race because we have more biological difference. So it's really not that we have a big DNA a pool that we all come from and we are different versions. We really are more different than in, for example, Star Trek. So we have to get along with a really measurable biological big difference between all of us, which is just something I find interesting to keep in mind in the all races species discussion, all racism discussion.
Differences in biology, but also through that, I think, a little bit in time. Like in Star Trek, you also have this common ancestry, but you also have this common era that are all in, like the Romulans, the Klingons, the Federation. They are all roughly at the same stage of becoming a galactic civilization. And I think from what little we've learned about Babylon 5 already, there is strong age differences in between there. Like it's strongly implied already that one of the reasons that the Centauri could take over the Narn so relatively easily is because they were just massively technologically more advanced. And then the Warlords are in this position of saying, they are a dying race because they are very much older again. And it was the same story in the Earth-Minbari War, where the Minbari seem to have been just a lot more advanced, a lot older species, so they just kind of steamrolled Earth. So there is not this sort of natural balance to the galaxy that you otherwise have.
Yes, which I think makes it more interesting because there are more measurable different kind of differences that have to be overcome in diplomacy, in acceptance, tolerance, all of these things.
Okay, let me steal your notebook for a second if I have some of my own notes still in there. Okay.
Maybe I could fill the void here with just a small little thing I found quite kind of cute. Well, I didn't have a car with a handkerchief, but at least he was dusting off his jacket arms. And at one point, when he was grabbed, that gave off this cute vibe he had in the movie. But I found it rather interesting to see that these space fighters, which also Sinclair mounts to take care of the raiders. Each one of these has a different painting or something sprayed on top of the ship. I think I saw there was something with just some geometric design, but I also saw something like a mermaid Uh, every ship has something different on top, and I think it's quite cute to put in the effort to design them that way, especially in the 90s.
It is. And with that, you already made a transition to exactly the point that I wanted to get at. Now that we've gone through a lot of the political implications and the thematic things, it was already mentioned at the very beginning that this looks markedly better than The Gathering does. But I think it's also still fair to say that Babylon 5 at this stage looks markedly worse than something like The Next Generation coming out around a similar time, because they have a bigger budget, they're working with physical models still, so there's just a lot more detail in there. And in every discussion about Babylon 5 early on, this is a point that's brought up, like, and there are kind of two camps, some saying that, oh, this is very innovative, they did like whole CGI that was like on a shoestring budget, so that's just very impressive. I'll say, well, it is, but it also looks a little bit like garbage now. I'm personally very endeared to it, especially because of details like you mentioned, Meike, that they are very unapologetic. They are not sort of saying, oh, our CGI doesn't look that great, so we're going to try and cast it in shadow or something. No, they're like, put them into bright light, put little extra details on there. We want people to like get close to their screen and look closely at these models and notice these tiny details, even though these details necessarily don't look very great. And this is something that you also see all around the station. Like, if you get these establishing shots of the station, it's never just Babylon 5 spinning on its own. There's little silly little astronauts going around, or repair robots that are like welding something on the station. There's little civilian craft going around. And I think that does a lot, like, once you get over the fact that this is very stylized and it doesn't look exactly realistic, but it does lend a lot of this entire atmosphere that this is a bustling place, that this is a big place. And it also extends to some of the stuff that they do on the inside, where they show like mud paintings of the entire large interior of the gardens inside the station, where they're just really trying to hammer home how big this place is, and sort of what a big command this is for the characters that are having to deal with the security of this place.
It just gives the whole station the feeling of it's alive. Yeah. Not just some. I mean, if we take it back to Star Trek, you have great views of the ship from the outside, but it looks empty. It looks like dead space, and that's boring, and it feels unrealistic, because you have in the back of mind always, oh, there are so many people out there, and this ship is so great, so big that there's so many people. But also, if you see people running around, they do nothing. I mean, there's a German comedian who made fun of this, that especially the very first one with Kirk and Spock, where you just see the people in uniform running around with a face like, I have to go on toilet, and running around just from the left side to the right side with no point of what they have to do, or no expression or anything. And if you have watched a bit closer behind the characters, you see their people act like they're talking to each other, or help redressing. I think it was when the telepath and Ivanova are talking at the end, where beside Ivanova sits a young man. It looks like he's waiting for someone, and that person isn't showing up. He's drinking something and has a drink before him, looking like, where are you? I have already ordered for you. Don't let me wait here. And that, the cozy feeling. I can't summarize it in another way. That's just
that makes it alive. Yeah, that makes it more seemingly relatable, I think, than in Star Trek, where everyone is just so cut down to the basics and optimized.
I think it sort of reflects also the themes that are going on in the show. Like, we see Babylon 5 and its council acting very much as a work in progress right now. It's not ideal, it's not all figured out yet, the rules are just being established, and you kind of see this in the station as well. In the opening, we see as the station is getting constructed, pieces are being brought together. We now see the station, okay, it's been constructed, but it's constantly having to get repaired. It's constantly buzzing with all this activity. And I think in the future, this is something to look out for throughout the show, that the state of the station that we see it in all these establishing shots actually try to add a lot to the motifs of the story that are going on the inside, which I always really liked. Whereas, yeah, you made the comparison to Star Trek. The Enterprise D is supposed to be pristine. It's supposed to be finished because it is like the definitive answer to the moral problems that it encounters, more or less. And this is definitely not the case here. And so we see it also in this more approachable way at first sight. Okay, I think with that we've gone through all the big discussion points that we had. So the last segment that we want to get to is
I just a little tidbit I have. It's just an appearance thing, but I would just be interested. What's your opinion on that? Because the first time I saw Lando, his hairstyle just reminded me. There's this secretary bird, which has his feathers around his head like a little crown. Which just came immediately to my mind when I saw Lando and his hairstyle, which changed a bit over the time of the episode, and I got this vampire Dracula feeling. First, he has this gray hair strands at the sides of his head, in the black hair, which gives this really old feeling. His fangs, which he shows quite, he almost presents when he confronts Jakar after Ragesh is attacked. Then he wears a cape later on, and his the talking all the time about blood. It was just so a Dracula image to me. I just couldn't get over it.
I really already talked about the French sort of costuming as the sense of a dying empire. But if you look at Lando personally, this like one singular count that is like part of an aristocracy that no longer exists. I mean, that is the theme for most classic vampire stories, where you have like this one very rich, very opulent individual that lives in this like decaying, decrepit castle. And I mean, that is definitely what he does. And especially when you mention like the secretary bird or the peacock hair, nothing that Lando has in his quarters and in its outfits looks in any way, shape or form practical. Like this hairstyle must take hours to get right every single morning. He is on a rampage to assassinate Jakar, and this rampage means he needs to fiddly like multiple things in his apartment to put together a very tiny, very comically looking weapon that is like most reminiscent of like these tiny revolvers that would be like for an aristocratic princess or countess to use. Then he has to put on his cape and then he storms out. When I imagine like Jakar going on a blood rampage, he doesn't take a weapon, he just storms out and uses his hand. So there is this like ceremony. Exactly, but there is this like ceremonial element to it that I absolutely love, that everything, even like the completely losing control and giving into his passions, is still like layered in this ritual and decorum that he has to get through, which is just, I think it showcases how much that is also defining part of his personality. Like he's acting really on this vision and of this idealized version of his people rather than just raw emotion, which seems to be much more on Jakar's side.
It's nice that you get it on that.
It is, but absolutely, I completely agree also on the vampire theming. Like that is 100%, right down to the accent. I think it's generally agreed upon that this is an accent that belongs nowhere and definitely has no resemblance of Earth in any way, shape or form, but I'm pretty sure I have heard people like trying to emulate a Transylvanian accent and landing somewhere there.
I think it sounds rather Slavic. Like it doesn't want to be like exactly one Slavic accent, but it sounds rather Slavic. And if you then end up at Transylvania, it makes sense because they speak Hungarian with a Slavic accent.
Yeah, so it's somewhere. It's definitely somewhere in that area.
I want to go to Transylvania soon. I will report.
Yeah, see how many old Centauri you can find there.
Yeah, please get us an autograph from Countess Lando. Sorry, I can't get this picture out of my head. Countess.
It's so dainty. It's glorious. I mean, my favorite part that we didn't even mention, and we didn't get a handkerchief in this episode, but we did see like Londo using the powder to like go over the little bruises and stuff he had. So even right down to that, he is once again very much like 18th, 19th century nobility that is like very powdery, very much on that kind of thing. But okay, I think we've exhausted most big discussion points. Also looking at the clock, I think we sort of have to conclude these things. So let's move on to the final part of our discussion, which is always the tapestry. And just to give people a little more of an idea of what that actually means, I will repeat the introduction that I gave last time of Babylon 5 being this show that is often equated or compared to modern television or modern streaming shows even that are very linear and that are very much one connective story, almost like one big movie that you can watch. And it is that in part. It is very different from the very episodic science fiction that you get in the 90s era originally, but it is also not completely that. So it's in this weird in-between state where I think if you just go into it with this expectation of seeing a completely linear show, it's going to be feeling very weird because there are a lot of very episodic stories in there. So to kind of counteract that and to kind of highlight the connective tissue of this show that isn't as obvious as in modern shows, we are going to try and build this tapestry, and we are probably also in this moment going to overlay a big graphic for that we already had in the first episode, where we list the different episode titles, and we are going to try and find these connections, this time between The Gathering and Midnight on the Firing Line. Like, are there themes or character traits or developments, story beats that relate these two episodes to each other and already start maybe moving towards a larger story or larger exploration of a specific topic that we might see?
My first impulse was to say, because actually, I think that in the first, in the Gathering, we saw that we are past a big conflict, a big war that we had in the galaxy, and we have like nations recovering from that. And now there's a completely different door open. Like, oh, we also have this problem that's also very old, and it's also getting very hot again. So I feel like we are still in. Here you have this, and here you have this, and here you have this. So that the connection is a bit not so easy to understand from this point of view now.
It feels like someone just throwing a bunch of garbage in front of your yard and say, here, start sorting out because I don't know where I am. A
very German example of...
Please stop recycling.
Exactly.
That's what I meant. No, but just the point that it's so much, so confusing, so many problems, so many things, so many piles that are still lying around that no one cared for until now or wasn't able to. That it's confusing, it's overwhelming. You don't know, you don't really have a direct connection because it feels more like it's still a representation of the world, of the situation, and the situation is big and complex and not easy to understand.
That is absolutely true. I mean, the one connection we definitely can pick up, because you already had seen this episode when we watched The Gathering, but one thing that you brought up is, of course, Jakar continuing with his shenanigans, and I mean, that has definitely happened, and I think, especially on the character level with Jakar and Londo, I think both of these seem to me like very natural continuations of what we've seen in the pilot episode, which obviously also makes a lot of sense that these were very fully formed characters right from the outset. And I do think that we start to see a little bit of a continuation between these two. I think in The Gathering, especially Londo is very much this sort of casino goer and this gambler and this person that has a very, very personal, depressive outlook on life. And in this episode, we get the confirmation where that is actually coming from. It's not just that he himself somehow maybe didn't reach the career level that he wanted and he's personally disappointed with where his life has gone. No, there's actually some truth to the fact that the Centauri Empire isn't what it used to be, and this is where his frustration is coming from, which I think just helps define him a little bit more.
Yes, and maybe at this point, because we don't have so many episodes to pick up things from,
Absolutely.
Maybe at this episode we could think about what we would expect to continue. And I can just think back into the first time I watched this, where I expected definitely that there would be like a big twist of things regarding the election on Earth, that I definitely thought that is going to haunt us. And then I thought, okay, this conflict that we have now opened up between the Narn and the Centauri, that definitely has to get hot again and become relevant. But at this point, while watching it for the first time, I had not yet an idea on why is this interesting, or why does it matter so much that we get all of this, really like mystical introduction to the show, like we are at the dawn of the third age. Okay, we have this war, we have this election. The why, as we have already said, is still missing.
Yeah, I completely would agree with that. Like, for how grand the introduction is, like, this sounds like an introduction into Tolkien's next mythos, like the third age of mankind has begun. And for that, the story that we've seen so far is fairly mundane. Like, sure, there's threats of big wars happening, but I mean, that's something that you also see in real life. That's not the sort of mythical age of heroes that we are promised in the prologue, I see usually. Yeah, Meike, what would you expect to move on from this episode? Because now you're absolutely in blind territory.
Yes. On one hand, I'm waiting for the explosion to come, because there has to happen something big, something that's maybe terrifying, maybe something that's disturbing the whole structure until now and throwing everything upside down. I hope very much that it's not always Jakar who turns out to be the mastermind of everything, because that would be fairly boring. And I would be happy if he gets a little more depth in his character, and that he has a development, that he's not all the time screaming for blood. And the same goes for Lando, because I already said this in our last podcast episode, that I would be happy to see he getting out of his depression and how, but I also would love to see change in Jakar. But also, what would be interesting to see more about the Minbari, because there was this big war always almost advertised, and we have absolutely nothing about it. I mean, here a few glimpses of information of what happened or not happened, but we don't really have anything to grasp about either Delenn nor the Minbari themselves. So yeah, it would be interesting to see what's coming from this side. And yeah, I want to know if Kosh is the internet troll he seems to be in this episode.
Oh no, that would have, if that ever becomes the focus of an entire episode, that will be a nightmare to witness and see what shenanigans he comes up with. But I mean, maybe he's the next one that's gonna be behind some like shenanigans that are happening that are not Jakar's fault for once. I mean, one thing that I take away from this was the recent rewatch of this episode is I think it's worth keeping a close eye on Sinclair, because he did essentially go against the government for his own reasoning. And I mean, how much Earth Force is going to know about this is, how much that's going to be reported is a good question. But I think it's interesting to keep in mind on like how far he might push this, right? Like, he was very quick to also entrust a lot of this to Ivanova and say, oh, you just didn't hear me, right? Wink, wink. Which, I mean, on one side just shows that he trusts this woman very implicitly, obviously.
But also he kind of knows that she does have to take his orders, I think, because she's in a chain of command under him. And he has a very hard time proving that he did something wrong if she just ignores his orders.
Yeah, I mean, this would be interesting to see. Does he just rely on his own authority to make sure that she does this, or is this more of a trust bond that they have there? So, yeah, that would be interesting to see.
Yes. Also interesting, we can also mention about him here, is that he does this because he has his own perspective on things, and his perspective is not only influenced from Earth. He has this weird close bond to Dylan and to the Minbari, like an understanding, like this respect that he has as a soldier from knowing them from war and now being friends with them, kind of.
Yeah.
So he acts as a human who has a broader a perspective on a broader scale, and I think that's interesting to just keep in mind about him. His perspective is not a fully human one. He's not like the typical human. He has this perspective on the galaxy from other kind of outside sources.
And I think we even see in this episode where this comes from when he talks about how long his family history goes back with them all being fighter pilots. Like, he has a very big awareness of history, just in general, of the different conflicts that are there. He even lists those to Jakar when he talks about surprise attacks, which we don't know how much this is common knowledge in this science fiction setting, but he definitely seems to have this like broader perspective and looking at things also from the idea, well, what history has played out before us.
Yes, they go back to World War II, I think.
Yeah, the Battle of Britain. But okay, I think in terms of looking forward and looking at the connections, this is a pretty good yield for the very first episode that we looked at. We have once again one final question that we are going to sort of ask outwards to the community that might be listening. And this time around, it's about this decision, how we start this podcast overall and how we start the series. And we are interested to know what your sort of chosen point for beginning this show is, because we have the pilot, we have this first episode. They both have definitely some contentious elements to them. There's also the TV film in the beginning that is a starting point for some people enjoying this show. So yeah, we're interested in knowing where do people go to start this journey, because that very much also informs the perspective that you have from the rest of it.
Maybe I should mention that the questions that we ask can be found on our social media channels, and you can vote and tell us your opinion. And we are recording in advance. So we will always pick up your responses and the polls and the results, but in a few episodes later, because we have a few more in a buffer. So yeah, visit our channels and vote and tell us your opinion and comment with things you found interesting, things you'd like to mention. Read this and we will talk about this.
Exactly. And we will also be down in the comments, like directly answering to some things if anything comes up. Okay.
And even if you're too tired, because maybe it's right now way too warm where you are listening or watching this, we are also very happy if you just leave us a thumbs up, a like, a heart, or whatever it is you're
like
able to share it with people. Yes, that would be very nice.
All general YouTube and podcasting stuff that you can do. Okay. Then with this, I think we're done with this episode. Oh yeah, the one thing that I always need to mention, next episode we're going to look at is going to be Soul Hunters, episode 2 of the first season. It's always nice that Meike is going to get also like a title drop for this and can get like a broad idea of what this might be about. Yeah, so we're going to talk about Soul Hunter next time, and yeah, we're going to see you then.